An elderly black woman walks into a posh city bank, patient but dignified. She's ignored, dismissed, and made to wait 4 hours while others are served. But when the board of directors unexpectedly walks in, everything changes, and the truth about who she really is sends shockwaves through the room. This is one story the bank will never forget. The hands of the old grandfather clock in Eloise Jenkins' living room pointed precisely to 9:12 a.m. when she slipped on her navy wool coat, the one with the velvet collar that her late husband had always admired. The morning sun peeked through the sheer curtains, casting a soft golden glow over the delicate porcelain figurines that lined her mantel, silent witnesses to a life fully lived. At 76, Eloise moved more slowly these days. Her knees ached when she climbed stairs, and her hands trembled ever so slightly when she buttoned her coat. Still, she maintained a grace that seemed almost out of place in the frantic pace of the modern world. Her steps were measured, her eyes observant, and her spirit quietly resilient. She had lived through recessions and wars, had raised 2 children on a schoolteacher's salary after her husband passed far too young, and had seen the city evolve from cobbled streets to skyscrapers. She had learned to adapt, but she had never allowed the world to harden her. This morning, as she boarded the 9:30 bus headed downtown, Eloise clutched a well-worn leather handbag close to her side. Inside was a thin folder, its contents slightly faded from age. Bank statements, insurance policies, and a letter from Franklin Monroe Bank requesting that she appear in person to discuss an urgent matter regarding her account. No specifics, just a line or 2 typed coldly at the bottom of a form letter. She had slept poorly the night before. Her mind, usually steady, had wandered restlessly over what this urgent matter might be. Had someone accessed her account? Was there a mistake? Or worse, had the bank decided to close it altogether? As the bus bumped along the city streets, Eloise glanced out the window at a world she no longer fully recognized. Coffee shops with names she couldn't pronounce, young people glued to screens, rushing past each other like whispers in the wind. It wasn't that she disliked change. She had, after all, learned to send emails and video call her granddaughter in college. But this constant, breathless evolution made her feel like a passenger in a world that no longer asked for her opinion. When the bus finally came to a stop in front of Franklin Monroe Bank, Eloise took a deep breath and stepped off. The building towered over her, all glass and steel and modern arrogance. Its reflective surface gleamed in the morning light, as if trying to impress the sky itself. She stood still for a moment at the bottom of the steps, straightened her coat, adjusted the strap on her handbag, and squared her shoulders. Then, she pushed open the enormous doors and entered. Inside, the air was cool and perfumed faintly with lemon-scented polish and fresh flowers that looked too perfect to be real. The marble floors stretched out in all directions, and behind a polished desk sat a young receptionist with perfectly manicured nails and a phone cradled between her shoulder and cheek. Eloise approached, offering a warm, almost maternal, smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but filled with the kind of steadiness that made people want to lean in and listen. "I'm here to speak with the branch manager. I was told to come in today." The receptionist glanced up with a sort of practiced disinterest that comes from seeing 100 people pass by your desk each day. She tapped something into her computer, eyebrows tightening ever so slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" Eloise tilted her head slightly, trying not to let the sudden coldness settle in her chest. "I was told I didn't need one," she replied gently but with quiet certainty. The receptionist let out a barely audible sigh and pointed toward a row of sterile chairs along the far wall. "Have a seat. He'll be with you when he can." For a second, Eloise considered pressing further. She could explain that she had received a letter, that she had come all the way across town on the bus, that she had lived long enough not to be brushed aside. But instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you," she said, and turned toward the waiting area. She walked slowly, past young professionals in suits far too tight, past a man arguing on his phone, past a teenage girl clicking away at her tablet. She took a seat on the edge of a stiff leather cushion, adjusted her coat, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. And so, Eloise sat, Time moved differently in bank lobbies, suspended somewhere between fluorescent lights and Muzak versions of once great songs. Her eyes wandered, and she thought, not for the first time, how strange it was to grow older. How the world slowly stopped looking back at you. People looked through you, past you, as if your age made you less visible, less relevant. But Eloise was not bitter. She watched people with curiosity, the way a father juggled his toddler on his knee while checking his watch, the way a young woman smoothed down her skirt every few minutes with nervous fingers. She remembered when she was that young woman, waiting to hear whether her first home loan had been approved, heart racing. She smiled to herself, and the memory warmed her. She had lived so many lives in one: daughter, wife, mother, teacher, widow. Now, perhaps just a woman with a folder, waiting for someone to remember she was here. She glanced up at the receptionist's desk again. Still no sign of movement. Still no eye contact. Still waiting. And though she was used to waiting for buses, for news, for change, today felt different. Not because she was afraid of what the bank manager might say, but because she realized, with a strange ache, how the world had stopped offering people like her a seat at the table. But Eloise wasn't here for pity or nostalgia. She was here for answers. She straightened her back, checked the clasp on her handbag, and breathed in deeply, the kind of breath a person takes before making their presence known. Because Eloise Jenkins, for all her gentleness, was not the sort to disappear quietly. The minutes crawled by like molasses on a cold morning. At first, Eloise Jenkins occupied herself by studying the tall glass windows of the Franklin Monroe Bank lobby, where sunlight filtered through in slender beams and cast fleeting patterns on the marble floor. The modern furniture, too sleek to be comfortable, was arranged in pristine symmetry, as if to suggest efficiency. But inside, time felt stalled. 10 minutes became 20. Then 45. 1 hour. The receptionist hadn't looked her way since that first exchange. Eloise, ever the composed woman she had always been, didn't fidget or sigh. She simply waited, as she had waited many times in her life. For news from the doctor, for her husband to return from war, for letters in the mail during quiet stretches when the world seemed to forget she existed. She watched people enter and exit the building. Young professionals with confident strides, retirees with thick folders clutched to their chests, parents with children in tow. Each was greeted with smiles, polite nods, and the occasional offer of coffee or tea. Their names were called within moments, and they were ushered into offices with glass walls and plush carpeting. But Eloise? She remained. Invisible. Unacknowledged. By the end of the second hour, even the receptionist avoided eye contact when Eloise glanced up. Her back was beginning to ache from sitting so long on the stiff bench, and the folded papers in her handbag felt heavier with every passing minute. Still, she refused to let discomfort morph into bitterness. She had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they were just running behind. Perhaps the manager was in a meeting. Perhaps there had been some mix-up. But she noticed things. She noticed the branch manager, a tall, well-groomed man with a shiny watch and a tailored navy suit, pass by her at least 4 times. Once he was laughing with a colleague. Another time, he held a coffee cup and stared at his phone. He never once paused to glance in her direction. Not even when he walked directly past her chair, so close she could smell the faint scent of expensive cologne and the crisp starch of his shirt. Eloise recognized him from the framed photo in the lobby, the one welcoming clients to the most trusted financial institution in the city. His name, Richard Alden, was etched into a brass plaque beside the door to his office. She had written his name in her journal the night before, circled it, and said a quiet prayer that he would be kind, that he would listen, that this wouldn't become one of those days, the kind that reminded her how easily people could dismiss what they didn't understand. By the 3rd hour, Eloise carefully stood, smoothing her coat, steadying herself with a hand on the armrest. She approached the reception desk once more, her steps slow but unwavering. She waited patiently for the young woman to finish typing before she spoke. "Excuse me," she said gently. Her voice was soft, yet somehow it cut through the ambient hum of the lobby. "I've been waiting some time. Over 2 hours, I believe. Could someone check with the manager? I was asked to come in today. The receptionist looked up, her face unreadable. For a second, her expression flickered with mild annoyance, as if Eloise were an interruption rather than a guest. He's busy, the receptionist said flatly. There are more important clients today. Silence fell between them. A long, uncomfortable silence. Eloise blinked once. Not in anger, not in shock, but in quiet recognition. She had encountered this tone before, in grocery stores, at airports, even in doctors' offices. The implication was always the same. She didn't matter enough to prioritize. She nodded once, with the same grace she had used all her life when dignity was the only armor she had. Thank you, she said with a small smile. Then she turned and returned to her seat. The receptionist didn't look up again, but others did. A young couple sitting across the room shifted uncomfortably. The man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "She's been here since we got here, 2 hours ago." The woman nodded, glancing at Eloise, her brow furrowed. There was something unmistakable about the way Eloise sat, hands neatly folded on her lap, shoulders slightly squared, eyes fixed on the window. There was no visible anger, no complaint, just quiet endurance. An elderly gentleman nearby coughed and muttered to no one in particular. Used to be a time when they treated people with respect. A security guard by the door gave Eloise a sympathetic look, but said nothing. Still, Eloise did not speak. She simply watched the world unfold on the other side of the glass. Outside, the city bustled on. Taxis honking, people laughing, a bike messenger weaving through traffic. Inside, the air felt heavier, quieter. She let her gaze drift upward toward the tops of the skyscrapers across the street, their windows catching bits of the afternoon sun. She had always loved looking up at tall buildings. As a child, she used to imagine what it might feel like to be up that high, to see the city from above, small and manageable. Now, she just wondered how many more hours she might be made to wait. There were many things Eloise could tolerate: the ache in her knees, the condescension in a stranger's voice, the slow erasure of older people from public life. But what stung, truly stung, was the realization that in the eyes of this institution, her time didn't matter. Her presence didn't matter. Not enough, anyway. Still, she would not raise her voice. She would not cause a scene. That had never been her way. But she was no fool. She knew that the way people treat you when they think no one is watching speaks volumes about who they are and what they value. So she sat, not in defeat, but in quiet protest. Every second she remained was a statement: I matter, whether you see me or not. And though her face remained composed, her heart whispered a single truth she had carried with her for decades. They may have forgotten who I am, but I haven't. At exactly 2:15 p.m., just as the afternoon sun slipped behind the western tower of the bank and cast a long shadow across the lobby floor, the air inside Franklin and Monroe suddenly shifted. What had been a sluggish hum of background chatter and muffled footsteps was now overtaken by a flurry of activity, like the tide turning without warning. The glass doors whooshed open in tandem, and in stepped a small entourage that seemed to glow with authority. The group, 5 in all, walked with confident strides, dressed in tailored suits that whispered wealth and power with every movement. A tall woman led the pack, her heels tapping decisively against the marble floor, her crisp navy blazer adorned with a delicate gold pin in the shape of an eagle. She barely paused at the receptionist's desk. "We're here for the quarterly board review," she said briskly, flashing an ID badge. "Please notify your branch manager immediately." The receptionist, who only moments ago had been scrolling idly through her phone, sprang to life. Her voice lost all its earlier disinterest as she scrambled to her feet. "Yes, of course, Ms. Whitmore. Right away." The change in the room was instantaneous. Staff members straightened their posture. An assistant dashed to refill the water cooler. A janitor quickly removed a stray flyer from the edge of the reception counter. Even the potted plants looked suddenly more alive. And then, as if summoned by magic, Richard appeared. Gone was the casual stroll he had used earlier that day as he passed Eloise without so much as a glance. Now, his every movement was polished and precise. Suit jacket tugged, tie tightened, hair smoothed into perfect place. His smile beamed with the kind of warmth that only power tends to receive. "Welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all here," he said, his voice nearly an octave higher than usual. The group began shaking hands, exchanging greetings, laughing the rehearsed kind of laughter that made everything feel like a photo op. Ms. Whitmore offered a tight smile as she surveyed the space, her sharp eyes scanning the lobby like a general on a battlefield. She exuded the presence of someone who had built herself from the ground up, and who wasn't about to be underestimated. And then she stopped. Her gaze landed on a figure seated in the corner, small, composed, and nearly swallowed by the oversized chairs. Her face changed. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally recognition. "Eloise?" she asked, her voice rising with surprise. "Oh my God, it is you." Without hesitation, Ms. Whitmore broke away from her group and strode across the lobby toward the waiting area, her heels clicking like a countdown. Every head turned. Conversations halted. Even the security guard by the entrance shifted uncomfortably. Richard's smile faltered. You know her?" he asked, blinking as if he had seen a ghost. Ms. Whitmore didn't even turn to acknowledge him. Her eyes were fixed on Eloise, now standing slowly, her face a careful mix of composure and quiet confusion. "Know her?" Ms. Whitmore said, her voice rising with a swell of reverence. She reached for Eloise's hands and grasped them warmly. "This is Mrs. Eloise Jenkins, one of the founding shareholders of Franklin and Monroe. She's the reason you have a job, Richard." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Someone dropped a pen. A junior banker whispered, "Did she say founding shareholder?" Eloise, for her part, offered a modest smile. "Hello, Amanda," she said, gently squeezing the younger woman's hand. "It's been quite some time." Ms. Whitmore, Amanda, was suddenly 10 years younger in the presence of Eloise. She looked at her like a favorite teacher from childhood or a long-lost mentor. "I had no idea you were coming in today. Why didn't anyone tell me? Why weren't you brought directly to my office?" Eloise tilted her head slightly, voice as calm as ever. "I believe they were busy. I didn't want to make a fuss." Richard took an involuntary step back. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Mrs. Jenkins, I had no idea." "I know you didn't," Eloise said, gently but with unmistakable weight. "You passed me at least 4 times today." The silence that followed was as sharp as shattered glass. Amanda turned slowly toward the receptionist, who now looked as though she wished she could vanish into the tile floor. "Did you really have her waiting here for hours?" I didn't know," the receptionist stammered, cheeks flushed crimson. "Her name was in the system," Amanda said firmly. "It should have been flagged. And even if it wasn't, a 76-year-old woman waiting that long in a bank lobby without being offered water, or assistance, or basic courtesy?" She turned back to Richard. "This is your branch. This is on you." Richard stammered. "There must have been some confusion. There wasn't," Eloise interrupted, not unkindly. "You simply didn't look." Amanda took Eloise's arm gently.
"Come. Please come with me."
"Let's go to my office. We have so much to catch up on, and I want to make sure everything you need is handled personally." Eloise hesitated, glancing around the lobby one last time. The young couple who had watched her earlier gave her small, embarrassed nods. The elderly gentleman across the room smiled, almost as if to say, "I knew it." The mood had changed completely, shame and awe colliding like thunderclouds. She turned to Amanda and nodded. "That would be lovely, thank you." As they walked away together, Richard stepped aside, his shoulders hunched, his once perfect tie slightly crooked. No one dared speak to him. And in that moment, Franklin and Monroe remembered what it had forgotten. That behind every institution, every polished floor, every billion-dollar figure on a quarterly report, there are people. People who built it. People who sacrificed. People like Eloise Jenkins. And they had left her waiting. Eloise stood slowly, carefully, as though rising from her seat wasn't just a physical act, but a quiet declaration. There was something in her movement that silenced even the rustle of papers and the subtle hum of the air conditioning. No trembling hands now. No need to adjust her coat or purse. She stood straight and calm, her shoulders slightly back, chin lifted. The posture of someone who had weathered storms and come through not just intact, but stronger. "I came today to speak with the branch manager," she said, her voice soft, yet unmistakably commanding. Gone was the patient gentleness of the woman who had waited for hours without protest. Now her words landed with the kind of weight that made people lean in, hold their breath, listen. "But I was told," she continued, her gaze fixed directly on Richard, "that I wasn't important enough." The words were not bitter. They weren't even angry. That's what made them so devastating. They were simply true. Richard's face drained of color. His hands twitched at his sides, and for a moment, he looked as though he might try to laugh it off, to downplay it, excuse it. But the look on Amanda Whitmore's face erased that thought before it could take form. She turned slowly toward him, eyes narrowed with barely concealed fury. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said carefully, her voice shaking not with rage, but with disbelief, "sits on our advisory board." There were audible gasps from the assembled staff, many of whom were now pretending to be busy with paperwork they weren't reading. A few assistants exchanged uncertain glances. Amanda took a step closer. "She helped fund the expansion of this bank 30 years ago. When we were still operating out of a basement office with no central heating, she believed in us. When we were nothing, a name on a brass plate and some ambitious ideas, she invested." Another member of the board, an older man with graying temples and a silk handkerchief peeking from his suit pocket, stepped forward. "Did no one recognize her?" he asked, incredulous. His voice carried the subtle edge of someone who already knew the answer but hoped, just hoped, it wasn't as bad as it looked. "No, sir," the receptionist said, voice barely above a whisper. We thought she was just—" She trailed off, realizing too late the trap her words had set. "Just what?" Amanda snapped, eyes locked on her now, her voice sharp enough to slice through marble. "An elderly black woman who didn't belong here?" The words reverberated in the space, bouncing off the glass and steel and settling like dust in the silence that followed. No one moved. Even the security guard at the door, who had been shifting uncomfortably just moments before, now stood stock still, his hands gripping his belt a little tighter. The receptionist's face turned crimson. She shook her head. "No, I just didn't know." Amanda raised her hand, cutting her off with a single gesture. "You didn't know because you didn't look. None of you did." She turned back toward Eloise, eyes softening. "And that, Mrs. Jenkins, is the shame of it." Richard, his composure now unraveling at the seams, took a step forward, his voice uneven. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Jenkins. Truly. If I had known." But Eloise lifted a hand. Not abruptly, not unkindly, but with the gentle firmness of a schoolteacher stopping a student mid-sentence. "No," she said. "I understand. You would have acted differently." The words hung there for a moment. Then she added with calm precision, "And that's the problem." There was no accusation in her voice, no anger. But the weight of the truth was undeniable. "You would have treated me with respect not because I deserved it as a human being, but because you feared who I was." Her unspoken meaning settled across the lobby, like a fog. Richard said nothing. What could he say? Amanda exhaled slowly, her face tight, with controlled fury. She stepped aside so Eloise could walk forward if she wished, and gave the rest of the staff a long, cold glance that made several of them avert their eyes. Eloise turned to the room, not to make a speech, but simply to be seen. Really seen. The same woman who had sat unnoticed for hours now stood in the same space, but somehow, everything was different. Not because she had changed, but because the room had. There was something poetic, almost biblical, about the moment. The way the first had been made last, and the last first. The way the truth, long ignored, had finally stepped into the light, wearing a navy wool coat and quiet dignity. "I didn't come here for special treatment," Eloise said, now addressing the room, her voice calm. I didn't come to remind anyone who I was. I came because I received a letter like anyone else would, and I followed it like anyone else would. She paused, her eyes scanning the staff. I sat patiently. I waited my turn. I didn't raise my voice. But I was still made to feel invisible. Because in this space, that's what age and color and gender still mean to some people. Amanda swallowed hard. A younger staff member, maybe an intern, wiped at his eyes. Eloise looked at Richard one last time. We all have choices in how we treat people. Titles don't matter. Money doesn't matter. Recognition doesn't matter. Not if it only comes after someone realizes they've made a mistake. Then she smiled, not out of spite, but out of a deeper wisdom. I hope today is the last time someone like me is treated like they don't belong in a place they helped build. And with that, she turned toward Amanda, who offered her arm. Eloise accepted it. Together, they walked toward the elevator, the board members following respectfully behind. The elevator doors opened. Before stepping inside, Eloise turned back to glance at the lobby one last time. Her gaze lingered on no one in particular, but it landed everywhere. On the young couple, the silent staff, the security guard, the marble floors that once reflected her silence back at her. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The boardroom on the 19th floor of Franklin and Monroe's headquarters was a far cry from the sterile, impersonal lobby below. It was spacious, draped in muted tones of walnut and navy, and filled with the quiet hum of controlled power, the kind that rarely raised its voice, but always had the final word. At the head of the long, gleaming table sat a chair usually reserved for the branch president or the highest-ranking member in the room. That morning, it was occupied by Mrs. Eloise Jenkins. The seat hadn't been offered out of pity or to placate some last-minute embarrassment. It had been offered, insisted upon, really, because once the fog of ignorance had lifted, everyone in that room understood exactly what kind of legacy they were in the presence of. Eloise sat with quiet elegance, her hands resting lightly on a pad of paper, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She wore the same navy coat, though it now seemed to carry a different weight, less fabric, more armor. Around her, executives, advisors, and board members leaned in as she spoke, taking notes with the kind of reverence usually reserved for keynote addresses. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke about legacy, about accountability, about how customer service wasn't a department, it was a value, about how a bank, like any institution, thrived not just on numbers, but on people, on relationships, on how you make someone feel when they walk through the door, whether they're depositing a check or asking for help. Her words were measured, precise. But every so often, her tone softened, and she spoke about her late husband, Thomas, and how they had invested in Franklin and Monroe when it was barely more than a name on a letterhead. About the meetings she'd attended in smoke-filled rooms where she had to fight twice as hard to be heard. About the promises they had made back then, about inclusion, about respect, about being the people's bank. And how, somewhere along the way, those promises had frayed. The room was silent when she finished. No applause. No forced praise. Just silence, the kind that comes when truth fills every corner and there's nothing left to argue with. After the meeting, Amanda Whitmore pulled Eloise aside and embraced her tightly, whispering, "Thank you for speaking, for staying, for reminding us." Eloise only nodded. She didn't come here for thanks. She had come for the truth. Later that afternoon, while Eloise was enjoying a cup of chamomile tea in Amanda's office, a decision was quietly made, not with ceremony, but with certainty. Richard Alden, the branch manager, would be transitioned out of his position by the end of the quarter. The official language in the internal email would refer to leadership restructuring and a new era of client-forward thinking, but everyone would know why it happened. More importantly, a full review of Franklin and Monroe's client service policies was ordered. Not just cosmetic revisions, but a complete rewrite. Every employee, from the front desk to upper management, would be retrained. Not just on procedures, but on values, on humanity. It was Amanda's idea to name the new training initiative the Jenkins Standard. And Eloise, ever practical, agreed, but only on one condition: that it wouldn't be about her name, but about what that name meant. Later that day, as the sun dipped low and the shadows of the city began to stretch across the sidewalks, Eloise made her way toward the glass doors of the bank once more. Her handbag rested comfortably at her side now, lighter somehow, as though the weight of being unseen had finally been lifted. The lobby had changed since that morning. It was quieter now, almost reverent. A few staff members offered polite nods as she passed, and even the security guard gave her a small smile and a respectful, "Good evening, ma'am." As she approached the entrance, she paused briefly at the reception desk. The same young woman stood behind it, her posture noticeably straighter now. Her phone was tucked away, her eyes alert, but what stood out most was the expression on her face. Not fear, not discomfort, but something far more human: remorse. When she saw Eloise approaching, she stood quickly, as if uncertain what she should do with her hands, her breath catching slightly in her throat. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said, her voice soft and trembling, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. If I had." Eloise held up a gentle hand. The receptionist stopped speaking. Her eyes brimmed with something deeper than embarrassment, shame, yes, but also understanding. It was in that moment she realized this apology wasn't just about a missed recognition. It was about something larger. About assumptions. About what we fail to see when we don't bother to look. Eloise smiled, a small, forgiving thing that somehow carried more weight than all the speeches she had given that day. "That's all right, dear," she said kindly. "But next time—" She leaned in just slightly, her tone as warm as it was unwavering. "Don't wait to find out who someone is before treating them with respect." The receptionist nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Yes, ma'am. I won't." And with that, Eloise turned and stepped through the glass doors into the fading light. Outside, the city moved as it always had, fast, loud, indifferent. But Eloise walked through it with the same quiet grace she had carried her whole life. Nothing about her had changed. Only now the world was finally catching up.